pricing confidence comes from value clarity. So the more you increase your value clarity, the better you understand your customer and the difference you make in what they care about and what they're trying to accomplish, you will simultaneously also be increasing your pricing confidence.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
It's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and when it's done right, the really close relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and today our guest is Chris Hopf. Here are 3 things you want to know about Chris before we start. He's been consulting for 18 years. He's been a pricing consultant for 11 years. And he created a pricing metric decision guide. This is an excellent tool that we're going to dig into a little bit more today. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
It's going to be fun. Hey, how did you get into pricing?
Well, I've been involved with pricing quite literally at every company I've ever worked for. Somewhat unique, but I've worked in a number of different industries. My very earliest experience into pricing was at a grocery store. I started as a courtesy clerk and had a manager that, we really got along well. The company was really growing fast here in the Seattle area. It was considered the high-end grocery store at the time. It's called QFC, but since has been acquired by Kroger. But he gave me opportunities to really be curious and experiment with pricing in the store itself. And then really at every company since then, I've been involved in some level with thinking about pricing, changing pricing, the pricing software being used, as well as really every functional area in a business. So it's been part of my life for a long time.
I thought you were going to say at the grocery store you got to man the pricing gun.
I did that too. Yeah. There wasn't much guns back then. We were scanning back. That was in the late 80s, actually, in the early 90s. But there was still some gun, those tags that were on the roll and they stuck onto the product. There was still some of that going on. Yeah.
I never got to handle one of those. I feel like as a pricing guy, I've not lived a full life yet. Hey, let's talk about the decision guide for pricing metrics that you put together. First off, why did you put that together?
Well, it's just been part of something that's evolved and been part of what I do as a pricing consultant. So as I've worked with a number of different companies and a number of different industries and really trying to think through the different trade-offs and the rationale around why you might choose a pricing metric over a different option that might be available to you, how to think about even the difference between, I think of there's a distinction between a pricing metric and a value metric. There are a lot of value metrics, but you have to be really selective around what you use as a pricing metric.
Let's dig in just a little bit. What do you think the difference is between a value metric and a pricing metric?
Well, it quite literally is, again, pricing is always, from my perspective, pricing is always tied to value. There are many sources of value. It doesn't make sense to necessarily use all of them as a way to determine whether or not your customer pays you more or pays you less. And so there are some, and that's really what the guide helps you think through is what are the things that I need to think about and be aware of how it might drive behavior, how it may affect the overall business goals that I'm trying to achieve as an organization, but also how it may affect how our customers perceive our value and how they use our solution and whether or not they're willing to continue to use it or even use even more of it. Does that help?
So can I share my definition?
Well, of course.
I absolutely think they're 2 different things. I think a pricing metric is what we look at from the seller side. This is what I'm going to charge for. And the value metric is what we look at from the buyer side. Here's how I measure the success of your product.
So I see where you're going with that. I would just suggest that there's some overlap there that we just need, and some nuance there that we just need to remain aware of. So if we keep them 2 separate like that, like you just described, you may miss out on some value communication that is really important. So for example, if you don't assign a pricing metric to a value metric, It's really important for you as an organization, though, even though it isn't necessarily affecting what the customer pays you, it certainly is affecting how they perceive your value and whether or not they will buy more from you and how they will just associate and understand their value experience with your organization.
Yeah. I think
that makes sense?
Yeah, I think we'll agree 100% on we need to understand where value comes from, and our company has to communicate that value to our customers. Absolutely.
And remind them.
Yes.
They'll take it for example, as far as using the term unlimited on a value metric or a pricing metric is really setting yourself up for, in a sense, what that tends to do is devalue the value they associate with whatever that might be. A recent, even today, at the recording of this conversation, Drift announced that they're going away from and they're moving to unlimited contacts. And so it will be interesting to see how this plays out. But when you use the word unlimited, your customers will start to take that for granted. And so even though you may not be pricing on it, it's up to you to make sure that you continue to reinforce the value of how, in this case, Drift is helping them manage, and understand their contacts.
Yeah, I could see how having unlimited takes away the fact that I don't think about this often. Therefore, I don't think about the value of using it as often as I would if I were managing, I've only got 1,000 contacts or 10,000 contacts that I could use.
Yeah.
Now I'm watching the value of those contacts. But on the other hand, I think that there are features like contacts in a CRM. By the way, is Drift a CRM company? I've read your article, but I didn't know who Drift was.
Oh, really? Yeah. So Drift is a software solution that basically I'm sure you've seen on many web pages, websites, where in the lower right-hand corner, there's opportunity to chat with somebody.
Yes.
In some cases, when you interact with that functionality, you may be interacting with a bot, which is really just kind of some very deliberate flow in which they want to walk you through. Or somebody could be live and actually you may interact with them in live. But the idea is that it's sales and customer conversations rather than maybe the old way or the prior way of primarily thinking about marketing is really kind of moving them through and getting them into your gated content and that type of stuff. So
got it. And so to Drift, a contact is whenever I use one of those chat buttons.
That's right, because one of the first things they ask is, what's your email address? And so many people, especially people in perhaps our work or my work or people that work with software solutions, it's you get so used to them, you kind of know what to expect when you encounter those. And so over time, it'll be interesting to see how that functionality evolves as well from a marketing standpoint, sales standpoint.
Obviously not part of the podcast, but I always type in, are you a real person?
I do too. Some form of that, like, are you really, are you there? Will you be able to answer my question right now? And oftentimes right when you do that, you realize the response that, nope, that's not really a person. It'll be interesting to see, their approach to making it free. So there's a lot of that out there. And that's one of the ways that they've grown so fast is through that network effect that a lot of websites have these on there. And so they look at the bottom, they say it's powered by Drift, right? So that's how they get additional free users, but then they're trying to convert them to paying customers.
And so when we come to the pricing metrics, let's I'm not exactly sure. I want to take this conversation so many different ways. When it comes to choosing a pricing metric, I love what you put at the top of your decision guide, because you essentially said, these are the things that you should be thinking about as you choose a pricing metric. So think of those as the characteristics of the metric, and you've broken that up into two big halves. One half is things that are really driving from our customer's perspective and things we want to look at from an internal company perspective. And so I thought this was really well done because you've thought through these a lot.
That's right. Yeah. And those are the conversations, these discussions, just pricing in general, these are hot topics within organizations. Everybody has an opinion. Where those opinions are coming from and what they're based in may certainly vary, across the board. But there really are trade-offs that you're making when you're making these. These are really business critical decisions. These are decisions that, we're talking about pricing metrics and value metrics, but ultimately what they really are in a sense is they end up being a big part of what is impacting your revenue metric, because they have a lot to do with both acquisition, retention, sales cycle. All of this comes into play when people are evaluating and considering your solution or your company. And so when they understand what it is you're charging them for, or what they are paying for, and when they will need to pay you more, these are all, in a sense, presenting either questions in their mind, or you're helping them move them and give them more confidence around choosing you. And so that's why we need to think of it not only, and oftentimes I've worked with a lot of clients where they've gotten a little too clever with their pricing metric, and they've really created a lot of challenges, if not on the front end as far as acquisition, certainly on the when it comes to retention and time for renewal. They get a lot of pricing pressure. There's a lot of, it's really elongating and stretching out that whole renewal process, because people start to say, well, why do we have to pay for this? Or, we'll renew if you do that, and so forth. And a lot of times it's around how they're being charged. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I was looking at the example that you had on your website in terms of using the decision guide. And one of the things I loved that you said, because if you score something a 3, then it turns green. And one of the things that's great about that is you say, look at the customer side versus the company side. Which one has the most green? Are we really pricing with our customers in mind, or are we pricing with our internal issues in mind?
Right.
But that was brilliant.
Yeah. Again, to describe it, and because this is audio, across the top, there's a number of different, what I call criteria, in which to evaluate different options, different pricing metric options. And that could be, which example are you looking at? Are you looking at the drift example, or the one that starts with viewer hours?
Viewer hours is the one I'm looking at right now.
Yeah. So again, it could be, you could have a pricing metric around viewer hours, concurrent viewers, bandwidth, number of channels or event pages, data retention term, whether it's number of days, number of months. Again, those are different ways in which, based on that metric, you could either charge your customer more or less. A common one that most people are certainly aware of is, again, number of users, number of active users, if you're kind of within aware of how Slack has approached it, and how just Slack's approach to that has affected how other people maybe think about their pricing metrics and so forth. So, but yeah, so again, when you are evaluating, if you think of each of these criteria as almost like a test, it's a question, perhaps a trade-off that you have to just be aware of. And then as you go through, and you don't have to overthink it, but you should have a reason why you're scoring. Number 3 is you just strongly agree, and you can actually maybe give an example or make a case, right, with one of your teammates around why you think this should be a 3. And a 1 would be you somewhat agree, maybe you struggle a little bit, it may not apply in all cases. And 0 is just, you have a reason. It's not that you just disagree that it applies, but you actually have a reason why it doesn't apply. And when you start to use the tool, it ultimately isn't going to tell you just like magically, this is the right answer, but you're going to feel a lot better around the decision you make. There's a very deliberate and intentional approach and awareness around the trade-offs you are or not making. And so back to your point just a moment ago around visually looking at it, once you're done with just taking an initial first pass, let's say, again, just with the conditional formatting, that's common in Excel. If you see more green on the customer from the customer's perspective side than you do on your company's perspective side, again, that's just kind of an overall trade-off that you have a little bit more awareness around. But it also can bring to light if you start to see it the other way too. It's like, really we're focusing on making this decision more on us, and we aren't spending enough time to really think about it and understand it from our customer's perspective.
And it feels to me that understanding it from the customer side is way more important than understanding it from our side.
It is. I would say that it's way more important, but not that your company side isn't important, right? So
absolutely.
But we could walk through some of them, and we could just kind of touch on some of those tests or that criteria that I mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to push back on a couple because there's a couple I don't like. Is that fair?
Well, of course. Yeah.
so relevant. I'm going to do the first 2 columns. Relevant to the business of most buyers and applies across the range of most use cases.
Yep. This is your customer's perspective side, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And what those both say to me is I haven't done market segmentation. And so I would think that if a company has done market segmentation, now what I care about is what's the use cases in that segment. And that's what I really want to focus on, as opposed to going across all these segments. In fact, you even write that in the top, supports differences in value across segments.
Yeah, so this is more overall from your overall customer's perspective. Again, it may be somewhat too subtle, but at the top, you can actually unhide between columns E and L, and it actually gives you an opportunity if you wanted to think about it more specifically for a customer segment. And you can think of segments or personas in a number of different ways.
Oh, okay. I didn't dive into that one.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to do here is just, again, you want to, from your company's side, even though we're looking at the customer's perspective, it is important that you don't make this too complex to actually execute as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So you want to look at it overall. And so you want to perhaps put yourself in the best position to narrow down the options or the pricing metrics you may be considering, and make sure that you aren't maybe going down a path where you have a pricing metric for this segment and you have a different pricing metric for this segment. There may be reasons to do that, but you should have really good reasons if you're introducing not only that level of complexity to your organization, but also, your customers are going to be aware that you price differently for different types of customers. So is that really worth, introducing that set of questions in their mind?
Yep. Yeah, understood completely. Easy to understand, no brainer, right? Easy to estimate or forecast requirements. Although I agree with it, let me hear your thinking.
Yeah, and so also just to describe for those folks that maybe aren't following along visually is, I also right below there, I have the option to weight these differently. And as you can see in here by default, or at least the way that I've set this up, those two that you just mentioned around simplicity from the customer's perspective, around easy to understand and easy to estimate and forecast, those are weighted at 1.5 each. And the reason for that is time and time again, this is what we're seeing actually play out in the real world. This is what we're seeing being one of the biggest contributors to why sales cycles are so long, or why people are holding off on renewing or expanding, doing more business with you, is because it's not easy to understand. And it's hard for them to kind of get their head around, well, how would I even forecast this? Even in this age of a lot of data at people's fingertips, you'd be surprised, Mark, at the clients I work with, and certainly companies you've heard of or perhaps have used or use, and how sophisticated they may seem on the outside around where they are with their data and their metrics and analytics. But oftentimes it's not the case as far as them actually being able to retrieve this and come up with meaningful insights around how it directs their decisions.
Yes. I've heard of companies who, one of their biggest complaints from customers is that their users want to use the product so much that they can't forecast their costs.
Yeah, that's why I have it in here. To try to capture that and bring that to light as you think through these different pricing metrics. Because, for example, if we look at the example here around viewer hours, in this example, I've scored that as a 0. I do not agree that that's easy to forecast, because most people don't think in terms of how many viewer hours, and they don't really know. Because again, think of this solution here as maybe like, I don't know if you recall Ustream or Livestream or, a video related type software solution. So, and so again, people don't necessarily know that or track that. And so therefore it would be very hard for them to estimate or forecast it. And therefore it's very hard for them to de-risk the purchase decision, because they really don't know where the pricing could potentially go.
Yes. Yes. Let's jump over to the company side for a couple minutes. Revenue scales with customer success. I think that one's a no-brainer. That's the one I think of when I think of a pricing metric has to be correlated with the value metric. So as the customer's getting more value from us, they're paying us more money.
Right.
And I think that one's just, spot on. Encourages increased use. Let's chat about that for a few minutes. I have the hardest time thinking about how a pricing metric could encourage use. Do you have any examples?
here's one perhaps example, and there's probably all sorts of different perspectives on this. There's certainly, you perhaps have seen different blog posts or mentioned in social media on this topic around having the per user as a pricing metric or charging per user. And from my standpoint and from my experience, it seems to me if you're willing to do it, you can always make a very compelling and convincing value case around why somebody should pay for additional user, right? Mm-hmm. Is because they're at the very core of it, why would they even want another user if they didn't somehow value using your, having another user in the organization use your software solution, right, or technology? So, yeah,
but I think that's true with any metric, right? So let's say that we were going to use gigabytes. Mm-hmm. Why would I use another gigabyte? Well, because I get value out of using another gigabyte.
Right. That's true. And so it's important as you're scoring and thinking these through and having these types of conversations as we are, is that you think of these in a relative term as well, as far as viewer hours perhaps increased use more than maybe gigabytes or bandwidth.
Yeah, right? Maybe.
So yeah, it's
what I often think of here is when I think about encouraging more use, I think, okay, if I paid this company $1, I'm going to get $10 back. I want to pay you $100 million so that I get $1 billion back. Right? That encourages more use. But if every time I use something you charge me money, now I'm trying to figure out how do I use less of it so I pay you less money.
Yeah. And back to the per user scenario, what people often will do is they'll kind of game the system, right? They'll share a login, right? So that they don't have to pay for that additional user. Yep. But that also goes into how you're framing your value and messaging. And also ultimately to how you price, right? So if it's significantly more to add additional user, right, then that's going to be a different, value conversation in people's heads around whether or not they're going to share that password because, hey, we don't want to have to pay for another user, or whether they just say, hey, you know what, you're going to probably be using this a lot. It's this much more to add this user. It just makes sense, right? Yep. Let's do it. So
I tend to think of that as discourages use less.
That's a good point. That is another way of thinking about it. That's true. Yeah.
Okay. Internal execution, simple to measure and easy to enforce. These seem reasonable.
Yeah. And just a quick note on that. So the simple to measure, again, surprising. I work with a lot of companies, publicly traded, VC-backed startups, and you'd be surprised at what they don't measure. And what they seemingly tell me is, well, we just can't do that now. And there are reasons for not being able to measure things, but then also the easy to enforce. And so a lot of times with software solutions, they haven't thought this through proactively. And so they may have a certain plan that, say, Mark, that you choose, and so you're using the software, and you could upgrade yourself or use functionality that really isn't available to you because they actually haven't put in ways to enforce, that you're on this plan. So there's a lot of that out there. A lot of times users don't discover that, and oftentimes they do on their own as well. So
yes, and then the last one, I'm not sure what I think about it yet. Tracks to differences in cost to serve. Now, The reason I'm not sure what I think about it yet is because I am always telling my students, my clients, costs don't matter to pricing. And
so here's the thing is that costs don't matter, but it is something to be aware of. So again, these decisions that you make around these pricing metrics and how people pay for and really invest in the value that you deliver, it's going to drive behavior. But it also can have a big impact on how much, from a cost to support standpoint, how many inquiries start going through to your support staff and your customer success teams and so forth. So it certainly is something to be aware of from your customer's perspective, and it can really make a big difference. So
I could see how this makes sense in the following way. Let's pretend that we didn't have that column and we weren't saying, does it track with our cost to serve? What we do want to do is we want to say, okay, here's the price, here's how much revenue we would get. Does that cover our costs? And we might have to go through lots and lots of scenarios to make sure that we're not giving money away to certain market segments or clients. And if you could simply say, yes, this tracks with our costs to serve, then we could be pretty confident that we're not giving money away to our customers.
Right. Or opening yourself up to unnecessary increases in your cost to serve.
Yep. I could see that.
That's the key question. Because just so you know, to make sure we're on the same page, from a cost standpoint, costs in my mind only come into play after you truly understand your customer and the value you deliver and your advantages over alternatives. And that ultimately will put you in the position to think through how to assort your value into offerings. And then that will ultimately put you in a position to kind of think through how you might approach pricing and the value case you can make for your prices and how to communicate that. And once you've done that, then cost really is only, does this make financially sense for us to pursue this type of customer or this type of business, right?
Yep. 100% agree.
Yep.
Absolutely. Chris, this has just been fabulous. I got to ask one last big question for you though.
Okay.
What's the one piece of pricing advice that you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Yeah, I actually answered a very similar question. It's in a blog post from 2018. Chargeify did a blog post around, I think it was titled something like Most Important Pricing Advice for 2018 or something like that. And that advice still remains today is give your pricing a chance. And so one of the best ways to do that, and one of the best ways to really inform your pricing should always start with really understanding your customer. So pricing confidence comes from value clarity. So the more you increase your value clarity, the better you understand your customer and the difference you make in what they care about and what they're trying to accomplish, you will simultaneously also be increasing your pricing confidence. So one of the best ways to do that is to contrast life with and without your solution or whatever you're offering the marketplace or your customers. That not only sets you up to better understand and better discover the value that you deliver and better understand your customer, but it also sets you up as an organization to actually execute and deliver that value, which is super critical, that execution side of actually delivering and reminding and reinforcing the value that you deliver your customers. That all comes into play into how people think about your prices when they choose you initially, when they choose to renew with you, and when they choose to do more business with you.
Excellent. One of the things I love about talking to pricing people is we all think the same. I never talk to a pricing person who doesn't have the same underlying beliefs and concepts. It's just a matter of how we talk about it. So
that's true.
I agree completely. Hey, Chris, thank you so much for your time today. If anyone wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Well, I would say just go to my website, go to PricingWire.com. If any of what I have there looks interesting to you or it seems to make sense, it gives you an idea of kind of how I think and my approach, then there's all sorts of ways to reach out to me from there. And
I do want to point out that the Pricing Metric Decision Guide is on there available for free.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So PricingWire.com. It'll probably be in the show notes, I'd imagine. So
yes, it'll be in the show notes. There's no doubt. No doubt. So, all right. Episode 19 in the can. Woohoo! This was fabulous. And I could talk about pricing with smart people all day long.
Yeah.
If you get value out of our podcast, would you please help us out? Subscribe, leave a review, tell a friend. Everything you do helps, and we're extremely appreciative. Also, if your B2B company needs to better understand subscription pricing, check out our new subscription pricing course. If you'd like to learn more about the course or have any suggestions or comments about the podcast, please drop me a note at mark@impactpricing.com. As always, don't forget to listen to next week's episode of Impact Pricing.